If you would, please start turning to Matthew chapter 24. Yes, this is the second message on prophecy from C2G within the same year. I hope you can survive the shock. This is some of what was left over from the previous message on Jacob's trouble. Matthew 24 is the very well-known Olivet prophecy in which Jesus gives us the progression of end-time events. And Matthew 24 also contains an apparent paradox that will be our focus for today. Before we get to that, the stage is set for this prophecy in the first few verses. Beginning in verse 2, we see that Jesus and the disciples are surveying the temple complex, and Jesus shocks them by saying that not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down. Now, the temple and its environs were the very center of religious life. And so Christ's statement captures the attention of the disciples. In verse 3, it shows that their location is moved slightly from the temple area across the Kidron Valley. This is moving east. And now they're on the Mount of Olives, from which they could still see the Temple Mount. And so when nobody else is around, this is a very highly controversial topic, but when no one's around, they say, "When will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Now, the disciples' question, whether or not they realize it, is multifaceted. It seems like they assumed that the destruction of that temple would coincide with Christ's return and the end of the age. As it turned out, the fall of Jerusalem, almost 40 years later, was the end of an age, but Christ didn't return then. And yet Christ's answer is also curious, because it answers both what happened within the first century, but also what will happen when this age truly ends and when he does return. And so both elements are found in his answer. There was an early, lesser fulfillment, but the true fulfillment still lies ahead. In the decades following this prophecy, there were false messiahs. There were wars and famines, persecution and martyrdom, and the gospel was preached. There was an abomination of desolation, and most of the Jerusalem church fled to Pella before Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed. But there weren't any heavenly signs, certainly not of the magnitude that's described in this chapter and in Revelation 6, and obviously Christ did not return then. So we'll pick up the flow in verse 10. Verse 10 shows that the pressure becomes so intense that there will be betrayal and hatred among God's people. It seems to indicate that betrayal may be for the sake of saving their own lives, that they are unwilling to lay down their lives, but will rather seek to preserve them by betraying their brethren. Now, obviously, this violates the Passover imperative of discerning the body of Christ. This foretells of a time when the spiritual strength of the church of God seems to be at a very low ebb, which corresponds with Christ's question that when he returns, will he really find faith on earth? When heat is applied, the unfaithful here will betray rather than sacrifice. In verse 11, this high-pressure environment leads to a rise in false prophets and widespread deception. Put simply, people are more easily led astray by teachers who promise them relief in some way. That relief could be promises of security when there's a lot of fear, or maybe their teaching instills a good feeling, especially when life is very difficult and uncertain. The result of the false teachers is found in verse 12. It says, "Lawlessness will abound, causing the love of many to grow cold." 1 John 5:3 gives us the basic foundation for the love of God as keeping his commandments. And so in an environment of commandment breaking, that is lawlessness, encouraged by teachers who ignore or even undermine God's standards, it says the love of God grows cold. Again, this paints a dismal picture of the spiritual state of God's people in the lead up to Christ's return. It doesn't mean that everyone will be in this state. But remember that Jesus is foretelling the general signs of his coming and of the end of the age. And so if we see hatred, betrayal, false teachers, lawlessness, and the love of many growing cold, we can know that the end is not far off. Now, in addition to the pressure and what it produces within at least some, Jesus gives us two more concrete signs. The first is in Matthew 24 and verse 14, where he says that the gospel of the kingdom, not the gospel of grace, will be preached in all the world as a witness to all nations, and then the end will come. That happened only in type in the first century. In Colossians 1, verse 23, Paul says that the gospel was preached to every creature under heaven. Now, some commentators suggest that Paul was referring to the general revelation that God gave to mankind, which demands the existence of a creator. They say that was the gospel. Now, it could also be that Paul was using some hyperbole to describe the evangelism of the apostles after Christ's death. But in either case, the full preaching of the gospel of the kingdom in all the earth still lies ahead. Now, the second clear sign is found in Matthew 24 and verse 15, which is the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place. That's a reference to three places in Daniel, including the 70 weeks prophecy, a section in Daniel 11, and again in Daniel 12. In Daniel 11, it says, "A king from the north of Judea, will show favor to those who forsake the holy covenant, and he will defile the sanctuary fortress, take away the daily sacrifices, and replace them with the abomination of desolation." It could be the abomination that causes desolation, or even the appalling abomination. Now, this had one fulfillment around 167 BC by Antiochus IV, nicknamed Epiphanes. He constructed an altar to Zeus within the temple at Jerusalem, and then he sacrificed swine on that pagan temple, or pagan altar. And for those who feared God and who respected his word and the holiness of the system that he had given them, that shocking abomination was horrifying. Now, there was a similar fulfillment, wasn't quite as dramatic, in the first century. Josephus records that when the Roman army under Titus came to Jerusalem to put down a Jewish revolt, the Romans entered the temple with their ensigns, the standards that they carried with them. Those standards included at least the Roman eagle, which was a graven image, as well as the image of the emperor, and that image was worshipped. And they possibly carried a bronze head of a dragon. They named it Draco. Josephus says the Romans made sacrifices to these standards in the temple, declaring Titus as imperator in the place dedicated to the worship of the Most High God. So while the previous fulfillments are clear, there are differing opinions on what a future fulfillment could entail. Some point to the holy place as referring to a rebuilt temple, just like the previous fulfillments. Others point out that all of Jerusalem, or at least the Temple Mount, could be considered holy, and thus it could be more general, requiring only an altar and not a full temple. Luke's account mentions armies surrounding Jerusalem, but there seems like there would have to be more to it than that for it to be really an abomination. But whatever the case, the pattern is that it will be idolatrous, honoring a foreign god in the place dedicated to the true God. Now, all of this leads up to verses 21 and 22, which are the first part of the paradox that I mentioned. Matthew 24:21 says, "For then there will be great tribulation, such as not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. And unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved. No one would survive. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened." This is maximal language. It refers to the time of greatest tribulation, which means pressure, and it includes persecution and martyrdom. And we find the same maximal language in the Old Testament prophecies, such as Jeremiah 30, verse 7, which says, "For that day or that time is great, so that none is like it. It is the time of Jacob's trouble." And again in Daniel 12:1 says, "There shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that time." So what lies ahead will be the very worst of times. They will be so perilous that unless God had put a limit on the number of the days, no flesh would survive. And yet for the sake of those whom he has chosen, a limit has already been placed. However, Christ gives other descriptions of this same time that may sound contradictory. Hold your place in this chapter, and please turn with me over to Luke chapter 17. Luke 17, Christ is again foretelling of his return. We'll start in verse 26. "And as it was in the days of Noah, so it shall be also in the days of the Son of Man. They ate, they drank, they married wives, they were given in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and the flood came and destroyed them all. Likewise, as it was also in the days of Lot. They ate, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, they built. But on the day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all." Verse 30, "Even so will it be in the day when the Son of Man is revealed." So on one hand, Jesus says that just before his return will be a time of great tribulation, unlike anything that has occurred in history. But here he likens that same time to the days of Noah and the days of Lot, and he mentions people eating, drinking, marrying, buying, selling, planting, and building. And so this is the apparent paradox. One part of the prophecy describes the absolute worst of times when everyone's survival is threatened. And then another part alludes to people pursuing normal activities as though nothing unusual is happening. Now, the bottom line with prophecy is that we simply will not know definitively until it happens. And so a good approach is to be aware of what the prophecies say and some possibilities for how they could unfold, rather than being confident in how it must take place. And this is not to suggest that there's no value in studying prophecy as we're doing today, but there is wisdom in acknowledging our own limited understanding and that we are still looking through a glass darkly. In this regard, the Messiah was not recognized in large part because of preconceptions of what the Messiah would be like and what he would do and how he would arrive. Those who rejected him believed that they had Scripture on their side. And it turns out that they had misinterpreted the messianic prophecies. But the same thing can happen to us. We have our own theories of what the end times will be like and who the major actors will be, and we have scriptures to back up our viewpoints. And yet it is quite possible for these preconceptions to blind us, each one of us, because of our tendency to explain away things that don't fit our mental picture. So as with everything else, we still need to approach prophecy with humility. And so we'll look at a couple of possible ways these seemingly contradictory passages can be understood. We'll begin with what Jesus intends by mentioning the days of Noah and the days of Lot. In Christ's descriptions, he gives us the activities of the people immediately before sudden destruction. But we should understand that these activities by themselves, the eating and the drinking and so forth, aren't actually any sort of sign. People have been doing this from the very beginning. Christ's point in these illustrations is not that the world before his return will be overflowing in good times, but rather he's emphasizing how unexpectedly God's judgment can fall. He's saying the future destruction will happen suddenly, just like what happened to the people of Noah's day and the residents of Sodom. Now, this emphasis on how unexpected the judgment will be is easier to see in Matthew's version, back in Matthew 24. If you'd please return there with me. In Matthew's version, Christ's illustration of the days of Noah is unmistakably about the unknown timing rather than the activities. We'll see this starting in verse 36. Matthew 24:36. But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only. Unknown timing. But as the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. Drop down to verse 42. Watch therefore, for you do not know what hour your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known what hour the thief would come, he would have watched and not allowed his house to be broken into. And once again, verse 44, therefore you also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Before and after Christ's mention of the days of Noah, his point in verses 36, 42, and 44 is the unknown timing. The overall flow and the context show that Christ is not saying that he's going to return when eating and drinking and marrying are at their peak, but rather that his return will be unexpected. And so Christ's reference to the days of Noah and the days of Lot don't contradict his warning of a time of intense trouble. The time before his return will be the worst of times, and his return will be unexpected, just as was the destruction by the flood and by fire and brimstone. The activities of the people at the time demonstrate that they had no clue about what was going to happen. However, there is another way to understand this seeming paradox, and it comes from one of the darkest times in history, certainly in more recent history. This example took place during World War II, when Europe went mad and tore itself apart, driven by ideologies that grew out of the Enlightenment, ironically enough. In 1939, Warsaw, the capital of Poland, was taken by Nazi Germany. Warsaw had a large Jewish population, and that Jewish population increased even more by Jewish refugees who were fleeing the front. In 1940, the Germans moved all of the ethnic Poles out of the area of Warsaw with the highest population of Jews, and they moved all of the Jewish refugees and Jews from other parts of Warsaw into what became known as the Warsaw Ghetto. The initial population of the ghetto was about 450,000, confined to an area of 760 acres. If you're not familiar with acres, that might sound like a lot. It actually works out to about 1.2 square miles. So the population density in the ghetto was extremely high. The Nazis built a 10-foot high fence around the Jewish section of Warsaw, and they topped it with barbed wire, and they shot on sight anybody trying to escape. Over the next couple of years, the borders of the ghetto shrunk as the captive population died off through regular executions, mass hunger, and infectious diseases. And that should ring a bell. Violence, famine, and disease epidemics. Those are aspects of the Olivet prophecy, and those are three of the horsemen in the seals of Revelation. The ghetto environment was an induced famine, with each person being allotted only about 200 calories per day. That's a tenth. It's a tithe of what's recommended today. If it weren't for the work of smugglers, the starvation would have been even worse. And because of the unburied bodies of those who succumbed to the black horse, plus malnutrition, the pale horse of disease, and especially typhus, stalked the residents of the ghetto. Now, the Nazis left the administration of the ghetto to a Jewish council of elders. The leader of the council chose a policy of collaboration with the Germans, hoping that accommodation might allow them to save more lives. The council was supported by the Jewish ghetto police, which was a force of 3,000 men who enforced the law as well as carried out orders from the Nazis. As mentioned, there was a thriving smuggling culture within the ghetto, and the really good smugglers became wealthy. Workshops, mostly underground, were hidden or created to manufacture goods to be smuggled out and sold outside of the walls. And there were also German-sanctioned factories for building material for the Nazi forces. And so there was industry amidst the scarcity. Now, despite the hardship, the Jews did what they could to establish educational and even cultural institutions, some legal and others underground because they were forbidden. The captives had hospitals, soup kitchens, orphanages, refugee centers, recreation facilities, a school system, secret libraries, as well as a symphony orchestra. There are even records of weddings in the ghetto. Even in this darkest of times, people endeavored to live with the semblance of normalcy. It's a testament to one of mankind's abilities, that of adaptability and resilience. Now, I'll read an excerpt from Wikipedia's article on the Warsaw Ghetto because it shows a human reality. This is quoting, an Israeli historian and Holocaust survivor estimates that around 20,000 prisoners, again out of more than 400,000, remained at the top of ghetto society, either because they were wealthy before the war or because they were able to amass wealth during it, mainly through smuggling. Those families and individuals frequented restaurants, clubs, and cafes, showing in stark contrast the economic inequalities of ghetto life. Another source estimates that group at around 10,000 people, consisting of rich industrialists, many council leaders, Jewish ghetto police officers, profiteering smugglers, nightclub owners, and high-end prostitutes, who were spending their time at over 60 cafes and nightclubs, quote, dancing among the corpses, end quote. And so even amidst the horror, some were living high on the hog, if you'll pardon the expression. While the Nazi strategy in the Warsaw Ghetto consisted mainly of starvation and encouraging disease, as well as regular executions, in 1942, Hitler set his final solution into motion. The Jews in Warsaw were told that they would be resettled to the east. Trains started rolling in, and the Nazis, with the help of the Jewish ghetto police, rounded up Jews and put them into cattle cars. But the trains didn't go east. The trains went north about 50 miles to an infamous camp called Treblinka. That was their final destination. As it happens, the mass deportation and extermination started on the 9th of Av. Between the 9th of Av and Yom Kippur, when the deportations ended, over 250,000 inmates, the ones who had survived the red, black, and pale horses, were sent to Treblinka. And perhaps fittingly, the last trains carried the Jewish ghetto police and other collaborators and the elites. Even those at the top outlived their usefulness to the so-called master race. Now, the Warsaw Ghetto is a microcosm of many of the elements in the Olivet prophecy. This is not to suggest that it was a fulfillment, but more like a foretaste. It serves as a sobering example of people working for a sense of normalcy even in the worst of times. Some achieved it more than others. As foretold, there was hatred and betrayal, with some Jews selling out their brothers for a little more security, a little favor with the occupiers, perhaps more and better food, access to nicer things, a little compromise for a little comfort, even though it meant dealing with the devil. But even amidst the war and the starvation and the pestilence, there was also buying, selling, and building, most for survival, but some becoming wealthy off their brethren. While there were few weddings, there were eating and drinking by those at the top, as well as cavorting with prostitutes, until the day the trains came and took them all away. And so getting back to the apparent paradox, we've seen two things. First, we saw that the intent of the references to the days of Noah and the days of Lot is less on the activities themselves and more on the fact that the people never knew what hit them. God's judgment fell swiftly. And in the same way, Christ's return will also be a shock to the world, even though those with spiritual awareness should recognize the things leading up to it. Yet the exact timing remains unknown. And second, the Warsaw Ghetto is a stark and sobering example of how life can go on until it doesn't. It shows what people will do to adapt to degraded circumstances to achieve a sense of normalcy. Maybe that means collaborating for the sake of perceived security. Maybe that means setting up schools and orchestras or heroically trying to save others. That happened as well. Maybe that means smuggling for survival or smuggling for profit. Maybe that means selling oneself for what one values more. But among many other dreadful lessons, the Warsaw Ghetto demonstrates the human capacity to adjust and to do what is possible to achieve a certain equilibrium. Now there's one more remarkable piece to this end times picture. Please look back to verse 22. Jesus says, unless those days were shortened, no flesh will survive. Some of you remember the heavy emphasis the Worldwide Church of God placed on prophecy. And verse 22 here played prominently in the church's presentations. That church, if you remember, developed more or less in the aftermath of World War II and the beginning of the atomic age. It continued through the nuclear age, including the Cold War and its continual threat of nuclear annihilation. It was commonly recounted in relation to this verse that there were enough nuclear weapons to destroy all life on the planet many times over. In addition, mankind has developed horrific chemical and biological weapons. Scientists have been creating genetically modified organisms for decades, presuming to know better than the Creator how the genetic code should operate. And more recently, military strategists are combining artificial intelligence with advanced weaponry, seemingly without regard to the inherent risks. What could possibly go wrong? And so mankind now possesses various options for wiping himself out. But something is being overlooked that significantly changes the landscape of verse 22. There's a parallel verse in Luke that shows the threat to humanity may not be what we have expected. Before turning to Luke, though, just keep in mind the context leading up to verses 21 and 22. Again, looking back, skimming from verse 15, there's the abomination of desolation, the warnings to flee, and a woe pronounced on those who are pregnant and nursing. Now please turn to Luke chapter 21. Luke 21, starting in verse 20. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, let those who are in the midst of her depart, and let not those who are in the country enter her. For these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days, for there will be great distress in the land and wrath upon this people, and they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So this is the exact same context, and this version gives a general geographical setting. It's Jerusalem and Judea. It talks about the land, which indicates the land of promise, as well as this people. This does not mean that there won't be trouble or tribulation elsewhere, only that the epicenter of the turmoil will be Jerusalem and its environs, and the troublers will be Gentiles. Now, this passage also fills in some of the details that tie this time of great tribulation directly to Jacob's trouble. Verse 24 describes death and warfare and being carried away into other nations. It also says that Jerusalem will be given over to the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled. And we can correlate that with Revelation 11 and verse 2, which says that the Gentiles will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months. The city will be trampled by Gentiles, and whatever worship has been taking place will be stopped. But the verse that's almost always overlooked is verse 22. For these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. The events here are the culmination, the comprehensive fulfillment of what has been spoken of before by the prophets. Jesus calls this the days of vengeance. And this vengeance is not arbitrary, like human vengeance, but a fulfillment of divine warnings given previously. And so putting these two chapters side by side, Luke's phrase, the days of vengeance, is parallel to the statement in Matthew that unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved alive. And suddenly the threat does not look like a lab experiment gone wrong, nor a weapons system identifying mankind as a threat. I'm not saying that there is no danger from those things, but that the threat here is specified as vengeance rather than technology. As it says, these days of vengeance have been written about before, and so we have to go back to what was previously written, and especially about what vengeance was prophesied, to understand why no flesh would survive unless God had placed limits. In short, this is the time of God's vengeance. It seems we've been looking in the wrong place, not looking high enough. God is the threat to mankind at the end, both to Jew and Gentile. That may sound shocking, but there are precedents. Remember that God wiped out the pre-flood world. All flesh was destroyed, save Noah and his family. God threatens to wipe out Israel and start over with Moses after the golden calf incident. And God also was ready to consume the whole nation because of Korah's rebellion. And so there are precedents and there are prophecies of near annihilation, or even annihilation of some peoples, like Edom. And there are numerous prophecies of vengeance, which I will leave for you to search out. But what is critical to understand is that God's prophesied vengeance is not one-sided. On one hand, the prophecies foretell his vengeance against his own people because of their rebellion. But on the other hand, other prophecies point to his vengeance on other nations who have done wickedly, especially in oppressing his people, nations like Edom, the descendants of Esau. And thus the time when mankind's survival hangs in the balance seems to parallel the days of vengeance when God takes his vengeance against all flesh, first Israelite and then Gentile. And this is seen most clearly in Zechariah 14, verses 1 through 3, which says that first God gathers all the nations to battle against Jerusalem, and the city is taken. We've seen those prophecies. But then God fights against those same nations. The iniquity and lawlessness will be so great and God's justified wrath so intense that unless he had shortened those days, no flesh, Israelite or Gentile, would survive his vengeance. Now, the world is not at that point yet, and thankfully we're not facing conditions like the Warsaw Ghetto. But let's return to what we saw about adaptability. Adaptability is a God-given trait, and it can be very helpful, but there is also a danger in that we can adapt to the wrong types of things. In that excerpt I read, one account records that those at the top of ghetto society spent their time at cafes and nightclubs. It says, this is the quote, dancing among the corpses. They adapted. It's an extreme example, but the question for us is in what ways we have adapted to our environments. Our consciences will adjust so that things that God finds abominable can seem normal to us through repeated exposure and gradual subconscious acceptance. This is why Paul allows us not to allow the world to squeeze us into its mold, because we will adjust to its standards or lack thereof, and may not even be aware of how far out of alignment with God we may be. If we adjust to the rising tide of sin so that it no longer phases us, our love of God is growing cold, or it has grown cold. In this same chapter, Luke 21:34, our Savior warns us to take heed to ourselves, lest our hearts be weighed down with carousing, drunkenness, and the cares of this life. Now, even if we're not given to drunkenness or carousing, the cares of life, all the things that are under the sun, are an ever-present threat to the calling that God has graciously extended to us. His warning is that we may become so caught up in the world's enticements or even just the ordinary activities of life, eating, drinking, buying, selling, that we are unprepared spiritually when our race comes to an end. Now, somewhere in our minds may be the thought that we will get serious about our calling when the time seems to be getting close. After all, we don't see armies approaching Jerusalem today. But the essence of Christ's warning is that even the intensity of the end times will not awaken people to their need, because even the worst of times can be adapted to, even as we are adapting right now. We dare not put off that preparation, because spiritual preparation takes place ahead of time. When the final time arrives, when the ghetto wall goes up, as it were, it may be too late. It was those who already had the oil with them that went into the marriage supper. Our preparation requires all the time that God makes available to us. And now I will turn it over to Ted Bowling for the remainder of services.